You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs. My guest is Lara Heimann. She's a physical therapist and a yoga teacher. She has a yoga movement called LYT yoga. It's essentially what she calls smart yoga. So we're going to talk about what that means and how it's different from traditional forms of yoga, maybe like Ashtanga or Hatha, etc. So welcome, Lara. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you would, tell me about your past and how you got into yoga in the first place, and then how and why you created this special LYT yoga protocol.
So I am a physical therapist and have always been very interested in health and wellness. I taught movement classes since I was in college and just always loved the education part of it and loved understanding the body and the connection of the body and the brain and the body and our mind, our mental state. And so I, chose physical therapy mainly because of that. I had originally thought I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, but then my dad, who's an orthopedic surgeon, I just knew that lifestyle was not going to be what I wanted. So I chose something that had a better lifestyle. And actually, now I'm so grateful for so many reasons, but it also is a profession that really allows you to improve your skills, especially teaching skills, working with people skills, all of those things, which are really, really crucial for being any kind of educator. I got my specialization. It's called neurodevelopmental training, which is a neuromuscular focus of physical therapy. So if somebody has some kind of injury or to the brain, then you can improve that by specific techniques that really elicit more brain activity. If somebody had a stroke and their one side was hemiplegic, instead of just putting that arm or leg in a sling, you would actually train it through developmental skills like we had when we were a child. And that part of the brain is very hardwired. And then other parts of the brain can form connections to make up for any kind of. So I was doing that, and I had started teaching yoga around the same time and was doing more of like the classic vinyasa type of class. And after a little bit of time, I started to put on my PT hat more when I was teaching and practicing and thinking about how even though I don't have a brain injury, I, like many others, have suboptimal habits that have formed a brain mapping, like a GPS. And if I changed like the way I practiced and did a little more focus on developmental work, core stability with, dynamic movement, and implemented that in my yoga practice, I was curious like what it would do. And I just experimented with myself, and it really changed the way my practice felt. It felt very alive and sustainable and refreshed and very balanced. I found that a lot of yoga practices emphasizing in-range mobility, which for anyone, whether you're really, really restricted or super loose, is not the best approach. And so I just started seeking more from the voice of functional movement and how we can mat as an opportunity to better rewire our movement habits in life. And at that time, this was 15 years ago, it was pretty novel. And also there were people that were resistant to that, thinking it was like not really yoga. Yoga had this formula and you couldn't really mess around with it. But people that actually study yoga, the physical practice of yoga, recognize that yoga itself was created and cultivated, inspired by many different movement practicing martial arts, military training exercises. So there was no cookie cutter approach. It's just when it got more into the Western world, we like to have things in boxes, I think. It's just like makes it more convenient. And so what I just summoned is my physical therapy mind, which critical thinking. What is the end game here? Is it to feel good in those moments I'm doing the class, or is it to really set up my body and my brain and my breath and my spirit for longevity so that I'm constantly kind of, updating the system, so to speak. And so that's when there was a big gap in that educational aspect. And it's no one's fault. I actually never blame the yoga teacher. The yoga Yoga Alliance, which is one accreditation. So that's a problem right there when you have such a monopoly. It really didn't have any oversight or trainings. People would go through teacher training, spend thousands of dollars, and not come out with any education about the body and how to actually speak to different people and different experiences in their body and how to change something according to that.
Well, one thing I noticed is, I've done yoga at various places. They'll be like, stretch your left hip using this particular, posture for 30 seconds. Okay, now we're going to do the right hip for 30 seconds. And sometimes that wouldn't be right because it would still put me out of balance. Let's say my left hip was much tighter than my right. I needed more time on the left and less on the right, let's say, but they just seem to do the same for everybody. And I also noticed that a lot of yoga instructors maybe it's just me, but they seem to give more time to the dominant side, and then the other side's quicker, and then moved on to the next posture. So like a lot of them are right-handed, so we'll do stuff on the right side, let's say, and that will go for 40 seconds, and then the left will be like 20, mentally just counting.
That's so funny to mention that, because in LYT, we start with our left side. And that is because even if you are left-hand dominant, the world is very much left hemisphere dominant, right hand dominant. So it is really nice to actually start. So we actually start everything on the left. So it's funny that you even mentioned that, because I forget until somebody will say, oh, I noticed you start on the left. And so I started to purposely encode these little changes that would actually create bigger changes in the brain-body connection. So it's interesting. And to that point too, like holding something for 30 seconds. Okay, what is the reason? What do I think about when I'm doing that? What are some external cues I can think about? Am I just kind of hanging in a joint, or am I pushing into the floor and trying to pull that energy up through the floor while maintaining length in my spine? So it's like small but significant cues that are often missing. And the reason they're missing is many teachers were not empowered with that. So they can call out a cue, they can call out a pose and tell you to switch sides, and they can string some poses together. But the nuances of what to do in those poses, what to be thinking about, what is significance. We're flexing in the hip, we're not flexing the spine, for instance, maybe trying to stretch out your hamstring. There's a lot of really biomechanical improvements that people can make that almost everybody needs because of our more modern lifestyle.
Yeah, so, I've come out of yoga sometimes worse off.
Yeah.
My pelvis was out of balance or whatever it is. So I would stop going when that happened. So
yeah, you're not alone. A lot of people. In fact, the reason I even kind of evolved and made it a brand, I had a small 10-person group class happening in my house. I built a studio there, and it was very, very successful and very no overhead, but what would happen is people would say, I don't feel like I can go anywhere. I think I'm going to get injured. And I thought, wow, that's a really kind of terrible thought, that you're going to go to yoga, and because that the teaching isn't informing you or maybe taking you, also the sequencing matters. Like how much are you preparing the body to then put the stress, good stress on it, that it can handle that. So to your point, that you don't walk away and you actually feel less imbalanced and you feel, maybe stressed beyond what the capacity.
So yeah, how is your training different? Does the yoga teacher say, let's say they're working on, again, opening up the left hip, do they say to people, notice how you feel, and if it's really tight, go a few seconds longer, or notice how you feel, and if it's like no big deal, stretch deeper, or don't stretch deeper, or
well, yes,
how do they accommodate people?
Yeah, I know you're using all the common lexicon. So often we don't ever say we'll go deeper, because that is a kind of competitive feeling. So it's more, and we also, honestly, we don't spend long amounts of time in a stretch. I've known this since school when I did my thesis on stretching, and that was 28 years ago. And now, of course, more and more research supporting it. They use dynamic mobility and some dynamic stretching, and then for certain people, some longer static stretches are good. But a blending of all of that, not all these long holds, because you have gravity. You have forces. We have gravity always coming down on us. And so when we're more aligned, gravity doesn't have as big of an impact. It travels through our body to the floor, and then that comes back up. That's called ground reaction. And then any kind of lever, any kind of change in the angles of joints that put you at a different position where gravity pressed down on you, you need to manage that. So it's so much better to actually stabilize your center as, like, say you felt your pelvis was a little wonky. Well, it's most likely not so much your pelvis, but the surrounding thing. Are you moving well in your hips? So we'll say, like, here's what you need to do. You put your fingers in your hip creases and help the femurs glide back. That's called a posterior glide. So the pelvis, you can feel when the pelvis is on top of your fingers, that's your pelvis. And most of the time, 95% of the time, we want our pelvis to be stable, not move. So when we're doing something on all fours like cat-cow, we're moving our pelvis and our spine deliberately to help mobilize some of the soft tissues around there and to kind of notice where there might be some more limp. But after that, you stabilizing and mobilize your hips. So when people are not moving well in the hips, they'll move the pelvis instead of that. That also moves the low back. And so that might have been what you were experiencing. You were moving the pelvis a little bit too much, and then it didn't feel as good. So we will really, I train everyone who teaches this method, the very robust training. And my philosophy is anyone and everyone should learn about the body. It's kind of mind-blowing that this is the one consistent thing we have throughout life, that we have a body and we don't know much about it. We weren't taught it. And you don't have to be a PhD to learn very basic mechanics, and then you can layer onto that. So we also are extremely specific. We have a blueprint that gives a lot of structure, and within that structure gives a lot of creativity. And that's like a rule of life, You need boundaries to then be able to grow. You have nothing, you don't, you're just amorphous. So we have a structure in our blueprint. We start off on the ground because that's where we all started in life. Those are called so that's where I infused my background. And we get on the ground, we get a lot of information, a lot of feedback. So one thing that happens, we live in our bodies and we're not as connected, knowledgeable, is we develop movement patterns really based on, I don't want to say like easiest path, but often it is, right? If you're tight in your shoulders and you were lifting your arms overhead, you might not stop and say, okay, let me glide the scapula. What you're do to execute the move is you'll thrust your ribs to help the shoulder, to help the arm lift up. So you're actually moving your rib cage to lift the arms. And then one might do that over and over for many years. And that creates more imbalances. So you start off with one kind of restriction and then you create more imbalances. And that's very common in today's life because most people are not moving in a variety of ways. So we have so many joints, over 200 bones. So bones come together and form. And these joints, especially the big ones, are made to move in a variety of planes, a lot of different levers with a we call coactive trunk, which is an active. And you say, of course, sometimes you have abdominals. It's everything from the bottom of your pelvis to the outer. How do you move your limbs with a really strategically, dynamically stable? And so we teach people how to do it. You start off on the ground for feedback, and we kind of prep, like, what is neutral spine? What is neutral pelvis? How do we get that? We start with bridge pose, and bridge is just not like thrusting your hips up in the air. It's actually keeping most of your upper back beneath your shoulder blades on the floor and really isolating your hip. It can activate that whole posterior chain, feel what neutral pelvis is like, where you're not tipping it, and you're also not compressing low back. We get a lot of support from the floor because your center of mass is supported. And that's just like the stages for a baby. We start off on our back. We learn how to flip over. We come forward. So we get one leg forward. That's called a half kneel. And then we come up to B by P. And those developmental patterns are hardwired. And that is actually what formed the construct of our brain, movement. 80% of our gray matter in our brain can be restructured from movement alone. And that just shows you how much forms sophistication. So we take advantage of that from the beginning. We get on the ground, we do this stuff, and then we work our way up. Whereas in a regular vinyasa class, you might sit for a moment, have a little intention, and you get like standing and moving. And your body is coming in to the class with its already existing kind of hardware, habits. And so we're using each class as an opportunity to rewire better move. And you do that by going through this. If you went to any class, whether it's a 15-minute class or a 75-minute class, there would need to be some kind of, we call the reset, where we reestablish our neutral spine and with an active through being we start moving in bigger movement pattern. But imagine if you haven't done that kind of preparatory work. It's almost like getting the circuits alive, and then you start moving in big ways on the mat. you're going to tend to move as you, but not necessarily stop.
Okay. So sounds like the training is very specific, very technical. Do you have a name for the type of yoga that this teaching works with? Or can an Ashtanga teacher, let's say, use it to modify what they're doing, or could a Hatha or could a Vinyasa or whatever
That's a good
existing yoga practice?
Yeah. Well, to me, the training is very much about, we learn functional anatomy. So, you have 200 hours in a first level. And so in another, like Ashtanga, I don't know if they eat much anatomy at all, but let's say it's 10 hours, 10 hours. Ours is probably 75 hours of functional anatomy, physiology, and biomechanics. And that is interwoven with the how to, so you understand it and then you apply it. So it's really tricky to get people who already are existing teachers and are like, can I just, without going, what I do have, we've graduated over 800 people in the last 3 years, is we have probably of those 800 people, 60% of them are already exist, some of them being teachers for over 10, 15 years. And so this is exactly what they were understanding of why, and then how to teach that, because that's what people walk away with. Like, oh, Lara, I remembered what you said, when I was picking up my kid and I had all this stuff in one hand, or I'm standing for a long period of time, or I'm sitting at my desk, that what we have taught really, really spills into real life.
Yeah, no, that's excellent that it helps people. So what's some of the feedback that people in these classes are giving versus what they used to do?
Oh, wow. Well, we have a lot of testimonies, but a lot of things people will say is, kind of like what you said, I didn't never really feel good at yoga. Or they'll say, that pose never felt great, but they continued to do it because they thought, that's the other thing yoga did, is it had this position of like a sage just telling you what to do. And what I said is, we're this together. I have more education about movement and biomechanics, but I'm sharing that. And then you're going to give me the feedback of how that feels. So to your point, like I would get in every class, we're giving a lot of different options, and they're going to be, and so we really encourage, like, what is the best thing for your body today? And here are some ways you perform this. So many people talk about the energy they have. They'll like run a marathon and slice off 10 minutes of their time without having changed anything else, or be able to go hiking and couldn't have done that before because they got low back pain. Mothers coming back and really feeling the integration of their core muscles again, their posture, in that all the kind of things that happen throughout pregnancy and afterwards when you're having stuff with your shoulders. I mean, we get a lot of busy moms who really feel like it's hurting themselves. I feel like your body is and that's what people say over and feel at home. I feel happy. My stress is lower. I'm a better parent. All these other things that don't necessarily always to the like preventing injury or improving, function. I work with Olympic athletes and it improves something, but then I work with someone who is just not stressed, and that stress can really manifest in a lot of ways. And one of them is pain, and pain and stress kind of ride side by side. They're like twin brothers. And people, if they start moving and understand that their body wants to work with them, it just kind of has to. So almost giving people like a new lease on life, especially if they have felt just dehumanized by like amount of pain and suffering, and that was unnecessary. Someone to say your body is super okay. So I think a lot of it is really energy, stress, feeling at home in their body, recovering, and preventing injury. So we have, I had a woman last week, 69, and wrote me, said, I have never felt so good in my life. Yoga had always felt not great for me, and I was really giving up on a lot of different forms and thinking I was just going to have to walk. And we actually it can be a very challenging practice. We implement a lot of different hands, inversion, plyometrics, because I kind of think of like, what are all the things our body and our to make us feel lit up? And we have to incorporate all of them.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. What kind of teachers take this training, and does it happen only in like one studio? Do they have to fly in and do it, at your place, or is it online?
Well, yes. So I used to do in-person trainings. I did that for about 10 years. And then I would fly in, but it just wasn't a great setup because I had a studio here for 9 years. And Princeton, it's not like, oh, I'm in Costa Rica, come and stay here for a month. You know what I mean? It's not exotic and exciting to go. And it's also logistically pretty challenging for a lot of people. People did that, but they would always say, oh, it'd be so great if you made something online. So I created an online one that is 200 hours. And that took me about a year to create. And I launched it in January of 2020. And, we had our first cohort in January 2020, and we had about 145 people in that. And then, of course, COVID hit. And so I was already prepared. So my plan was to do one training a year, but we have now been doing 2 onlines a year. And now that everybody's getting back to more of a normalcy of life, I think online is always here to stay, but people are going to want some hybrid. We're creating some hybrid options that we have also a self-guided option for somebody like a teacher who just wants all the information, but doesn't want to join into a kind of, because it's a pretty intense thing. It's 10 weeks, there's Zoom calls and all that. So we do have a self-guided to take that on there. People have loved that as well.
Okay, excellent. And again, are you attracting particular types of practitioners, or does it seem to be across the board?
I think that, we also have an online platform. So our online platform is just for anyone. It's literally like a regular fitness wellness platform that I also started in 2019 before I started. And we have thousands of people on there from 67 years. And I think if we were to look at our the archetype, it would be the working professional who really wants to take the time and effort and money to spend on themselves. We have the busy moms. We have the kind of wanting to age with joy and pro-aging people who really recognize, and I'm kind of in this group, I'm 53, so it's 50 and over, really recognize it's time, if you haven't done it already, to really learn about your body, because some things that maybe we could have gotten away with earlier on are going to be harder to get away with now. And we don't have to do that. We can learn about our body and actually live with a lot of vitality and vibrance. So I would say those are our biggest pockets. We do have men. I would love to get more men on there, but men, and that's why we also go by LYT Method. And we call it this comprehensive system that includes physical therapy exercises, yoga, functional training, stress relief, that kind of thing, because that sometimes can be a little more welcoming for people, especially men, I do think, are more just a little bit hesitant perhaps to try something that is yoga if they have an idea that might. We use some yoga, certainly some yoga poses and some of the underlying philosophy much.
Okay, well, very good. So Lara, how can practitioners or people that are taking a class or want to do it on their own, I don't know if it's appropriate for those kind of people, but how can they find out more? Where can they go?
We have a lot of entry points from a beginner wanting to get back in shape. So they just find us on lytyoga.com, lytyoga.com, and look at the online classes. And then when you go there, it is a lot. We have over 500 classes, but we really have broken it down in categories. Once you sign up, you'll get kind of an email chain that will shepherd you through a little bit, it's called our launch pad. So if you are brand new to this, here are some videos you should watch for understanding the language and understanding some of the biomechanics. And then here are some classes. And then we have a search engine where you really I want 15 minutes and I want for my hips mobility. That class will come up there. So everyone's been trained by me. We have a lot of physical therapists who actually created classes on there. But there are also some senior letters who aren't physical therapists will actually think they are because of so. Yeah, just check that out, and you can write us with any feedback or question.
That's excellent. Okay. Well, very good. Can you restate, again, website and best ways to contact you, multiple different ways so that people listening can find out?
So lytyoga.com, LYT. So LYT is an acronym, which is very medical, but it's kind of like an onomatopoeia. When you say it, how you feel it, like being lit up, but it actually stands for Lara's yoga technique. So lytyoga.com. And you'll find a link for my podcast on there, Redefining Yoga. You'll find the online classes. And you can always message me on Instagram, lara.heimann. I'm pretty active. It's a really good place to message. My email box gets pretty loaded up. So I would just try and reach out there.
Excellent. Well, Lara, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.